Well, I was about their age. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but it was. Every year we went fishing at my grandfather's farm. Now we called it the Pop Pop's farm, but it wasn't really a farm. There were no animals. There was no crops. It was basically a house in the middle of the woods close to the Tennessee River with no electricity, no TV, no internet, a well, and it was really roughing it in my mind as a kid. But the best part of it was getting to go on the Tennessee River and go trot line fishing. And I loved trot line fishing because it was 100 hooks, and you just left it out overnight. And you came back the next day to see what you had. Well, I didn't have to go overnight. I was a kid. I got to stay home. My dad and my grandfather did that. But you did. You came back, and the best part was trying to figure out how many fish you'd catch and hoping that, it was closer to 30, 40, and not 5. And hoping that as you pull this line in, you would find something amazing. And the ultimate goal was hopefully catching a lot of catfish. The only problem with trot line fishing is once you start going down the line, you want to make it to the other end. Meaning if you get about halfway through and a barge is coming up the river, you've got two options: cut the line and add a float and hope you can find it again, or go fast. The other thing you don't want to see is clouds. Now, this picture here doesn't show clouds, but we were at a spot just like this on the Tennessee River, and we were about a third of the way in when it started to drizzle. 2/3 of the way in, I am no longer enjoying myself, because as a kid, you don't mind the rain, but then it starts getting cold, and the wind picks up. My dad is yelling at me now to hurry and grab the net to get the next fish, and I'm miserable. By the time we get to the end, my grandparent and my father have already decided we are not going to try and make it back to the dock. So as I huddle in between my parents, we end up at a bank like this, as close as we can to the shore where we can't get out, but at least maybe it'll give us a little cover against the wind. My dad happens to see some trash up there, and he finds a big metal sheet, and he's holding it up to guard us against the wind and the rain. That lasts for all of about 30 seconds until ba-boom, and he throws that thing as far as he can from us. And I just remember in that moment the terror of realizing what it's like to be caught in a storm with nothing. And that's what the story we're talking about today is. This story comes from Mark. You can actually find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but I love the way Mark captures it. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." I've always loved this story. One, because it shows the humanness of Jesus. I don't know about you. I'm one of those people, I love falling asleep to the sound of storms. But this just shows you how tired Jesus really is after healing people all day, after teaching parables to them, and finally just wanting to get away from the crowd. He says, "Let's go off to the other side." He is so tired that he is soaking wet on a boat rocking back and forth, and he is still able to sleep through it. The other part I love about this is I've always wanted to know, how long did it take for them to wake up Jesus? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 30 minutes? At what point did they finally decide we need to wake him up? And my favorite part of all of it is they did not wake him up to do a miracle. They did not. We see by their faith, when they woke him up, they were not expecting him to stop the storm. They're actually terrified when they realized he could do that. So that means they woke him up so he could share in the misery. That's all it was. Hey, you need to wake up because we're about to drown, so you might as well wake up for it. That's what they did. But isn't that the case, though? When we're afraid, we want others to know. Hey, this is scary. This is real. We don't always let it come out that way. Sometimes it comes out in anger and frustration in other ways. But we want people to understand, no, this isn't good. I have to be honest, a lot of the rest of the sermon is actually not my own words. I'll actually be reading from a sermon that I found a month or two ago from listening to a podcast. It was titled the same sermon, Overcoming Fear. It's actually almost 100 years old. It's done by a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrote this sermon in 1933, and when I was listening to it, the funniest thing was all I could think of was, man, these are words we need now. He lived in a time, he's a German theologian, preacher, and scholar. In 1933, they were dealing with civil unrest, political back and forth as new parties were fighting each other for who should have power over their country. And it's at that time that he got up in January of 1933 and preached this sermon. And I want you to hear these words as he started. The overcoming of fear. That is what we are proclaiming here. The Bible, the gospel, Christ, the church, the faith. All are one great battle cry against fear in the lives of human beings. Fear is somehow or other the arch enemy itself. It crouches in people's hearts. It hollows out their insides until their resistance and strength are spent and they suddenly break down. Fear secretly gnaws and eats away at all the ties that bind a person to God and to others. And when in a time of need that person reaches out for those ties and clings to them, they break. And the individual sinks back into himself or herself, helpless and despairing, while hell rejoices. Now fear leers that person in the face, saying, here we are all by ourselves, you and I now. I'm showing you my true face. And anyone who has seen naked fear revealed, who has been its victim in terrifying loneliness, fear of an important decision, fear of a heavy stroke of fate, losing one's job, an illness, fear of a vice that one can no longer resist, to know that fear is only one of the faces of evil itself, one form by which the world at enmity with God grasps for someone. Nothing can make a human being so conscientious of the reality of powers opposed to God in our lives as this loneliness, this helplessness, this fog spreading over everything, this sense that there is no way out, this raving impulse to get oneself out of this world of hopelessness. Hearing those words, I couldn't help but my heart break for our world today. Because I think those same words could be used, words of hopelessness, of fear, of being so terrified of the world around us, of the things going on. Because it feels like no matter what, we always hear of the next horrible thing going on. And he goes on and talks about, though, which how sad that is, because we serve the one who died so we didn't have to fear. We serve the one who in Psalms, David says, I prayed to the Lord and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Or as in another Psalm, 56, it says, but when I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. We've already shared in communion today. That's the beauty of the Lord we serve. That when he died on the cross, all those failures, all those sins, all those problems, the fear was nailed to that cross, leaving us the fruit of the Spirit of hope, of joy, of love. But Bonhoeffer points out the problem isn't that we have this joy. He goes, we should know it. We should be shouting it from the rooftops, this joy. that we have, that we don't have to be afraid anymore, that we have the person who we can turn to at any time when fear comes knocking on our doors. We can go to God. And what a blessing that is. But then he hits hard after giving an analogy talking about Christ is in the boat. I mean, look at the disciples. Here they are, fearing for their lives, and Jesus is literally in the boat with them. The maker of everything, the all-powerful, the one who loves them more than even himself, is in the boat with them, and they don't recognize that. Bonhoeffer goes on and says, we were along on that voyage, weren't we? And the call, Christ is in the boat, was once our salvation too. And now, strangely enough, all of us are at sea again. On the voyage without faith, without hope. Overwhelmed in chains, in bondage, paralyzed by fear. We have lost heart, lost the joy of living. Our limbs heavy as lead. Each of us knows what it's like. Perhaps, or most likely, we don't even quite realize what has happened to us. We are already so used to the state of affairs that it seems natural to us. We almost like it that way. All this misery around us and in our own lives, what would we do if we couldn't even complain anymore? I say that again. What would we do if we couldn't even complain anymore? And that's the worst of it. We don't even want to find a way out. That is the final triumph of fear over us, that we are afraid to run away from it and just let it enslave us. Fear has conquered us. It can be found among us in various forms. Some people have become dull and insensitive and just live from one day to the next, brooding gloomily and doggedly. Others are noisy about their fear, pouring it out to everyone else in the form of crying and complaining. Still others, on the other hand, think they can drive their fear with fine words and bold fantasies, and if they shout these words loudly enough, it may seem to take care of things for a while, but those who know can recognize in such empty words the horrifying power of fear all over again. Fear is in the boat, in our nation, in our lives, and even in this very church. This naked fear of the hour from now, of tomorrow, the day after, that is why we become apathetic, why we complain, why we intoxicate ourselves with this or that. Fear is breathing down our necks. He points out, and I think this is the thing that I wanted to focus on, because when I heard those words, I said, isn't that so true? And he lived... This was 90 years ago. Before 24-hour news, before social media, before we could hear of every single disaster that happens miles away, not just tomorrow, but minutes from it happening. We live in a world that we've gotten so used to hearing the bad news, the fear, that we've just accepted it. We don't say it that way, like he said. We say it in other ways. We complain louder and louder about how things are going. We lash out when people disagree with us. And this is where I want to quote a famous master, Master Yoda. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. It's so true. Think about this. You're afraid that your job isn't going well and that your job might be on the line. So when a coworker asks you to help, you lash out in anger because it's between you and them for the job. And because you have this resentment, you start building up that anger to the point that you start to hate this person and resent them. To the point that you don't even like going to work anymore because of how it affects you. the suffering that it causes you. And I always love that, because when we say suffering, you always think about suffering that get caused to others, but it's not even just what causes to others, it's how it affects the inside. That's how fear starts. That's the danger of letting fear in, is that it doesn't stop with fear. It moves to other things. Jesus said it this way. He says, then turning to his disciples, Jesus said, that is why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food to eat or enough clothes to wear. For life is more than food, and your body more than clothing. Look at the ravens. They don't plant or harvest or store food in barns, for God feeds them, and you are far more valuable to him than any birds. Can all your worries add a single moment to your life? And if worry can't accomplish a little thing like that, what's the use of worrying over bigger things? I'd never caught that little part before. He's saying, hey, when it comes to what am I going to eat, what am I going to wear, he says those are little things. And he says, what's the use of worrying about those? And if worrying about those doesn't help the little things, what's the point of the bigger things? He says, if you can't even affect the little things in your life, why would you think you can change the bigger things in your life? If you think about it, a lot of the things that we do worry about are out of our control. That's why we worry, because we don't have control. It all comes back to this fear. And let me be honest, we all have it. I was thinking about just when you preach on something and you know what you're preaching on, you can't help but see it in everything you do for the week before. For me, I've told you, and part of me coping with that fear is I have to speak it out. And so one of the things I say regularly is I actually am terrified of being up here speaking. I don't like being up in front in a big group. And so I downplay it because I'm afraid. I'll make excuses. I'll say things. And the truth is, it's not even that I'm afraid. I don't even think I'm afraid of speaking. What it is I'm afraid of not being good in front of you. It's why I have to push myself harder, do more, and make everything better than what is expected of me, because I don't want someone to, heaven forbid, think that I'm not doing a good job. I am. I'm terrified of criticism. I'm terrified that you might think I am not putting in the effort. And the truth is, when you go even further under that, it's really because I'm terrified that you won't love me. Again, these are just the things that pop in my head. I don't know how many times I started to worry about, what will they think of this? How will they affect this? And I'm sitting here going, oh my goodness, that's fear again. Every time I got angry at something or frustrated with something or started going down this path of, well, what if, I realized every time, whether it was a big fear or not, or whether it's just a small voice in the back of my head, that was fear. Whether it's you lashing out at the kids because you don't know how you're going to cover something because you're not willing to share. Maybe it's you're distancing yourself from friends and family because you're too afraid for them to know the truth about something. Maybe it's the politics. And heaven forbid someone judge you or think you're wrong or think you're right. And so in fear, we say, I'll get the comment out first. I'll say something before they can, because that way everyone will know. Or even worse, maybe you say nothing and you're worried, well, if I don't say something, people might think I'm approve of this. See, again, it's still fear. It's the fear of how will people see this? If I say something, if I don't say something. And I understand there is a time and a place, and that's where wisdom comes in. But I can tell you this, if it comes from a place of anger, of hate, of frustration, you're probably in the wrong place. And this is why Bonhoeffer is so key on this, because he wants them to understand it has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with the school system. It has nothing to do with your job. It has nothing to do with the kids and the family. It has nothing to do with those people. It has all to do with you have forgotten the most important thing. That Jesus said, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, You will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Jesus is very clear. You're going to have struggles. You're going to have problems. That's not the issue. The issue is that you have forgotten that I'm right there in the boat with you. I've always wondered what that story would have been like if it had been after the resurrection. After the disciples had learned the true power of the Holy Spirit. Would they still have worried? Would they have sat there calmly saying, Jesus is here with us, so it doesn't matter what happens? Or maybe, in the words of Paul, to die is to gain. Where they can have so much calmness and joy and love and peace in their life where they say it doesn't matter what outcome happens. It doesn't matter how tomorrow goes because Jesus has today and tomorrow and the next day. He paid the price so we didn't have to worry about it. No matter what outcome comes, Jesus is still on the throne. In good times and in bad, it is still Jesus. That's actually the most comforting thing. I'm sure, like many of you, I don't like change. Sure, we like change when it's, add additions to the family or the new iPhone or whatever, that new. But when we change things the way we've always done it, we get agitated and we fear what that change might be, and yet we serve a God who is constant, who says that there is nothing that can change the outcome. And so he says, don't fear. I want to read this last little bit as Bonhoeffer concluded his sermon. He said, this is faith. It does not rely on itself or on favorable seas, favorable conditions. It does not rely on its own strength or other people's strength, but believes only and alone in God, whether or not there is a storm. It is the only faith that is not superstition and does not let us slip back into fear, but makes us free of fear. Lord, make this faith strong in us who have little faith. I think what's so powerful about this sermon isn't just what he was preaching, but knowing the rest of the story. This sermon was actually preached only a few weeks before Hitler would come to power as part of the Third Reich Party. In the years to come, Bonhoeffer would be told he's not allowed to preach anymore. The school where he would be teaching would be told they're not allowed to teach anymore because of their faith. Bonhoeffer, when Hitler comes to power, would actually speak out against the Nazi Party, saying that this is unacceptable. Eventually, as they get closer and closer to war, he finally boards an airplane, leaves to New York, thinking that he'll just ride out the war as a professor in the U.S. But only after being there a short time decides if he is going to help lead the Church of Germany after this war, he has to experience it with them. And so he will go back to Germany, preaching and teaching at his own risk, eventually even leading up to being captured, put in a camp, and dying only days before the end of the war. And yet his last words, and through the whole time, he was writing letters, encouraging Christians. And the reason he could do this is because he didn't have fear. Because why? Well, his last words are, this is the end. For me, it's the beginning. He knew where his life was going. He knew that today, tomorrow, and the next day didn't matter because he already knew where his place was in life, and that was a citizen of heaven. He said it didn't matter who was on the throne on earth because the heavenly throne, it was all that mattered. He said it didn't matter what happened to him today because he was already locked in for tomorrow. And so he knew that all he was here to do was do the best he could with what he had, to give hope and joy. Because the truth is, there are so many people still living in fear. And he even says in his message, it is the most selfish thing about fear is the fact that it focuses all on us, so that it keeps us from doing what we're really here to do, is to help others escape their fear. Because the fear focuses inward and makes it about ourselves when we are called as Christians to look outward. I'll leave you with this. I think it's so powerful. Jesus gives the Great Commission. And he says, go baptize people, making disciples. And he ends by saying, teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I'm going to invite the praise team back up. And I just want to encourage you. The truth is, I don't know where you are. That's the hardest part about this job. Some of you might be dealing with crippling fear right now. Some of you may have never been baptized. Maybe you don't even realize the hope and joy that comes with having the Spirit inside of you. Maybe you're like the disciples and you're in the boat with Jesus, but you've kind of forgotten because the storm got big enough that you kind of forgot where to put your faith. And so I want to encourage you, whether it's restoring that faith or if it's simply finding that faith for the first time, we invite you forward to pray over you, to encourage you, to help you realize there is only love with Jesus, and that pure love, true love, it pushes all fear out. So will you stand as we sing?